So, officially, welcome to North Star Interventions using policy as an organizing tool in our data center fights. My name is Ali. I work with the AI Now Institute, supporting groups and communities facing direct harms from AI infrastructure and technologies, and I'll be our facilitator today. This webinar is a launch of AI Now's new policy toolkit to stop rampant AI data center expansion and a conversation with incredible organizers on how to use policy interventions as an organizing tool to both fight individual data center developments and advance statewide change. For a little bit of background, AI Now is a fully independent policy research institute founded in 2017. We work to challenge and reimagine the current trajectory of AI away from commercial surveillance, the consolidation of power in big tech, and lack of accountability. And our research and policy work aims to connect the upstream problems in the AI industry and market to the downstream problems and harms on everyday people. We aim to equip organizers, advocates, and policymakers with tools to fight back. And we are part of a nationwide coalition of community groups and organizations fighting data center expansion. I'll speak a little bit about this at the end, and that work led us to where we are today and the content that we will share in this session. Next slide, please. So how will we spend our time together for the next hour? We are learning who's in the room with this poll. Thank you so much. Please do it if you haven't yet. Kate and I will spend a little bit of time breaking down why we need North Star policy directions to win our fights against data center expansion and preview our policy toolkit. And then we will spend most of our time in a panel discussion with three incredible local and state organizers who are leading and winning data center fights across the country. We will have time for Q&A with them and share some resources and next steps. And I want to clarify to start us out that the goal of today is not to break down the harms of data centers, but to get into the weeds of how policy can help address those harms. If you are newer to this issue or looking for more information, our toolkit also includes a section that breaks down in detail the problems of data centers and has a number of other resources. Okay, just want to share out our poll results really quick. You should be able to see them on your screen. Just want to highlight that we have a range of people here, which is great. Folks who are fighting specific developments, local and state policy change, and a bunch of folks who are trying to figure out what to do. Welcome. You are all in the right place. Our toolkit is really designed for people still figuring this out, what to do before a data center comes to town, as well as folks actively experiencing and pushing back against harms. All right. Next slide, please. So what is our North Star Policy Toolkit? This resource is primarily geared towards stopping, slowing, and restricting rampant data center development in the US at the local and state level. We include North Star interventions, aka the strongest possible interventions and demands, plus scaffolded steps to get there for when that is not feasible. This policy toolkit emerged from a need we were hearing from organizers and policymakers around the country. In our role both within and outside the nationwide coalition work, we have been supporting organizers in a number of site fights against particular developments. And in some of these situations, such as a hearing is popping up in a week, or city councilors and organizers have an opportunity to work together to take action, it has not always been clear what to demand. For example, what should we be asking for in terms of regulating large quantity water users? What does an ideal approval process look like that places decision-making power actually in the hands of community instead of placing that power with developers? And this kind of lack of clarity is partially because many of the existing ordinances out there and proposed regulations are either highly specific to their jurisdictions or stop short of transformative policy. So this toolkit is intended to address the gap and to help organizers and policymakers take advantage of these critical moments of opportunity and identify and call for the strongest possible actions. I want to make two other notes before we start and preview the toolkit. This toolkit comes from a place that data centers, particularly hyperscale expansion, needs to be stopped or at least heavily curtailed. That is the foundation of this work. And that is due to the extractive relationship between data centers and local communities, both those physically neighboring data center facilities and those in the same electricity grids, water tables, air quality spaces. And because hyperscale data centers, as we know, deplete natural resources, increase pollution, increase the use of fossil fuels, raise energy costs for everyday ratepayers, pull tax dollars away from community needs, fail to deliver on overpromised economic development, and threaten tribal nations' sovereignty and lands. So we understand and come to this problem from all of these harms and from a place that data centers are the physical manifestation of big tech's takeover of our society, regulations, and basic resources, and it does not need to be this way. Next slide, please. Last note here, we developed this toolkit over the last few months in consultation with around 50 incredible community organizers, state advocates, technical experts, and policymaker networks. Contributors are listed here, and I just want to say that we're so grateful to everyone on this slide and give a particular shout out to the Data Center Working Group and participants at the Memphis Organizer Training hosted by Media Justice and Memphis Community Against Pollution, and all of you for your support and wisdom. And we have also in this process consulted with a long list of existing ordinances and recommendations from community organizations and technical experts. These are included at the end of the toolkit as well. I am now going to turn it over to Kate to walk us through the guide.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Allie. Hi, everyone. It's so nice to see you. I'm Kate Brennan. I'm the Associate Director here at AI Now, and I oversee our research and policy programs. So before we drop the toolkit in the chat, just a few more things. As Allie mentioned, we felt there was a strong need for a policy document with the North Star directed at stopping or at least severely limiting rapid development of data centers. And importantly, we felt like we shouldn't have to sacrifice this North Star visioning with the in-the-weeds, nitty-gritty details that we know make policy turn. So that's exactly what the toolkit is designed to do. I kind of want to make you think of this toolkit like a menu of options, as you see on the right, that also lists the detailed ingredients for each entree. So at a 30,000-foot level, you'll see a comprehensive list of different interventions across a range of issues that might be relevant to your community. And then when you click into each recommendation, you'll see highly specific examples and language to include in your demands and ordinances. So Allie is now going to drop a link to the toolkit in the chat so you can click around and explore while I talk a little bit about how to use the toolkit and what it contains. So next slide, please. Great. So as you'll see, it's long. It is a menu of options, and there's a lot in here. And so we know that not everything is going to be feasible in every location. So every recommendation should be analyzed in relation to your local and state conditions. Strategy. The entire document is framed on the belief that we, the public, should decide whether or not a data center works in the interests of our communities. So you'll see that the issue-specific recommendations around water, around energy, around air quality can be used both to limit the impacts of data centers and to act as mechanisms to reject data center development proposals when they do not work in the community's best interests. 3 examples. Throughout the guide, we provide examples of existing or proposed ordinances, policies, laws, and we indicate if we think they are very strong, weak, or cautionary. Just because we included an example doesn't mean we endorse the specific language, but in cases where there isn't a strong example, we've consulted experts and community advocates to identify the North Star recommendation, threshold, or quantitative targets. Additionally, in the doc, you'll see a section called Key Considerations for Policymakers, where we outline some important things to keep in mind when crafting demands or policy intervention. These are things like considerations around preemption, which level of government, state or local, will be the most effective for each intervention, what stage your community is at in terms of data center development, and the importance of enforcement power and strong penalties. Right now, we're seeing ordinances across the country that are strapping a $1,000 fine for violations of the law on data centers. We know $1,000 means absolutely nothing to tech billionaire companies, so we identify how to craft meaningful enforcement actions across the recommendations. And finally, you'll see on the very front page that this is a draft. And we're intentionally launching this document today as a Google Doc so we can continue to receive feedback from folks on the ground, changing and updating to new conditions and information. We also know a page document isn't the always easiest the way to navigate information, so we're also working on building a microsite with all of this information and plan to launch in early 2026. So now I want to give you all an idea of the broad scope of recommendations in the document. So I'm going to walk us through the high-level recommendations that are in there before turning it back to Ali to do a deep dive on 2 specific recommendations. So next slide, please. So here's an overview of our interventions that are targeting local governments. We begin with ways that local governments can prohibit or restrict data centers, enact temporary pauses like moratoriums, or reject data centers that don't fit within a local government's goals. We go through the detailed process of establishing conditional use permits. This is one of the most important things that a local government can do. Right now, many data centers can be automatically approved under existing zoning laws, and conditional use permits mean that a data center cannot be approved unless it abides by certain conditions. We outline additional information on zoning ordinances and municipal code amendments, which can further be used to restrict or limit where data centers can be placed. We review local governments can institute strong noise mitigation measures, protect water resources, regulate and limit energy use, and repeal or limit tax incentives and subsidies. The toolkit also looks how local governments can implement air pollution community health measures. I want to call this one out because we know that currently data centers are installing backup diesel generators on site, which poison our local communities with toxic air pollution. And finally, at the local level, we review how governments can establish local fair labor requirements, consider community benefits agreements, and protect their constituents from AI harms. I also want to call this one out because passing regulations prohibiting harmful uses of AI technologies is another important way to ensure that data center development is not working in service of technology that harms our people. So on the next slide, you will see an overview of our state and regional recommendations. These are primarily targeting the state level, but some of them may span multiple counties or several states, such as recommendations that regulate public utility commissions. So here we discuss statewide moratoriums, oversight and transparency mechanisms, and repealing or limiting tax subsidies. I want to call that one out because it's very important because states can actually exempt data centers from paying taxes, which drains critical resources from our local communities. These are funds that can go into schools and local infrastructure projects. We spend a significant amount of time in the doc on energy regulations at the state level, including how states can establish strong ratepayer protections, promote grid stability, and accelerate renewable energy infrastructure. We also discuss how we might limit corporate influence over the processes involved in data center development, like the public utilities process and elections. And finally, we discuss state fair labor requirements and ways that states can protect their constituents from AI harms. This is particularly important this week, right now, as the federal government is actively working to try and block states from regulating AI. So I will now pass over to Ali, who will take us through the detailed recommendations for 2 different interventions.
Thanks so much, Kate. I'm going to get into the weeds on 2 different examples so you can understand how we are pulling together the ingredients in this policy menu. And there is the same level of detail and actually quite a lot more on everything that Kate previewed. So for one example of our local recommendations, how do we protect water resources at the local level? For context, data centers use immense amounts of water, and despite this, tech companies are increasingly planning to build data centers in water-scarce locations. Our overall recommendation here is that local governments pass water ordinances that limit the impact of data centers and restrict data center development when proposals do not work in the community's best interest. So what does that look like? First, in local regulations, clearly defining large quantity water users to include data centers, especially hyperscalers, and we have quantitative numbers in the toolkit to help you figure out centum cubic feet and what that means. Second, require all large quantity water users that you've previously defined to submit an application for substantial water use. and ensure in that process that the city critically has the power to reject applications when this water use is incompatible with what is available. And critically, make sure that applications are presumed rejected from the start unless the developer can prove they meet the requirements. These applications must include all types of data center water usage. That includes water used in data center construction, server cooling, facility cooling, including cooling towers, and other ancillary water uses. Many current data center water projections currently do not account for all of these areas, which is why we need to put it into the requirements. And this also needs to include the full water footprint, all of the different types of water sources, blue, piped, gray, etc. This is already happening. This is not something that we made up. For example, Aurora, Colorado currently stipulates that high water use industries projecting consumptive water demands above a certain threshold cannot be developed without water sustainability measures. Next slide, please. There are a number of other things we can do at the local level to protect water resources. I'm going to go over these with a little bit less detail. We can require robust water conservation plans with independent review that go into water efficiency requirements, water replacement rates, and recycled water offsets. We can consider what type of cooling to allow, liquid cooling versus evaporative cooling. Confusingly, liquid cooling uses little to no water, but more electricity, and air cooling is actually more water intensive. And the toolkit breaks down these type of pitfalls as well. And we have seen jurisdictions, particularly those that are water scarce, prohibit evaporative cooling. We can also require strong transparency mechanisms and monthly reporting so you can shut off water supply when there are violations and ensure that the financial burden is on the data center developer and operator, requiring data centers to pay the upfront infrastructure costs for their water usage and taxing water usage with no exemptions, including increasing that rate during droughts. So again, this is kind of a medium level overview of what the toolkit includes, but all of these protections together would be a robust set of policy interventions to protect local water resources. Next slide, please. And really quickly, I just want to go over what this would look like at the state level with state transparency mechanisms. Again, this is one example of the policy recs in the toolkit. This is important because data center developers and operators often want to keep information about their deals secret, obscuring details from the public, and they argue that transparency is needed to prevent their competitors from understanding trade secrets and to protect their negotiations for tax incentives. But what we know is that we need strong state-level oversight and transparency mechanisms to ensure that they cannot hide critical information from us, the public. So a practical approach to this includes amending state transparency laws, which are often public records laws or agency disclosure laws, to ensure that we prohibit trade secret exceptions, require digital copies of documents, so we actually have access to what is out there, and protect against anonymity vehicles. That's things like shell companies, for example. A number of jurisdictions and states are introducing legislation to flat out ban NDAs, non-disclosure agreements in economic development projects. This has a critical impact on data centers. And we can also establish statewide clearinghouses, in other words, requiring states to design, implement, and maintain publicly accessible websites to provide information about all the data center facilities in the state, tracking water and energy usage, and funding that through fees that the data centers pay. And lastly, requiring statewide review of data center projects to make sure that resources are tracked and evaluated holistically. I'm going to ask to stop sharing now. Again, that is one example, and the toolkit gets into quite a lot more. And thank you so much, Kate, for walking us through that. We are now going to move into our panel discussion to explore how these policy interventions can be an organizing tool. And again, I'll encourage folks to drop in questions, either from what Kate and I shared and from the discussion we're about to launch into in the Q&A feature, not in the chat. So pivoting. While we need to understand what the strongest possible policy interventions are, we also know that implementing them differs widely by jurisdiction and requires us to navigate not only questions of what is technically possible in our laws and regulatory systems, but also our varied context and political conditions. And I could not think of a better virtual room of people to talk us through how that actually happens and how we can fight for the strongest possible protections. So our panel for the next 25 minutes or so will explore how we use policy to address data center expansion in practice, diving deep into local ordinance fights in Tucson, Arizona, statewide policy efforts in Georgia, and the role of policymakers. So I'm thrilled to briefly introduce our panelists. These are three incredible organizers who've been fighting on the ground, doing the real work. Kate is going to drop in their full bios into the chat, and I'll just briefly summarize. Give a big welcome to Mary Black, an incredible environmental justice advocate, climate storyteller, Afrofuturist, and artist from Raleigh, North Carolina. Mary served as the youngest person ever elected to Raleigh City Council, their loss, and is currently the co-manager of the Black Hive at the Movement for Black Lives and the founder of Radical Futurist Labs. Angelantonio Enriquez Breault is a place-based and biocultural educator and restoration practitioner based in Tucson, Arizona. He is currently serving as the No Desert Data Center Coalition rep engaged in the City of Tucson's Community Advisory Committee on new large water user ordinances, so he can tell me everything that I just said wrong. And that process is meant to safeguard against extractive industries like data centers in Tucson. And lastly, Connie DeSico, a native Georgian who started her career with a master's in filmmaking and eventually entered politics, including grassroots volunteering and working as chief of staff for members of the Georgia General Assembly. Connie ran for office in 2020 and in 2024 joined Georgia Conservation Voters as political director, where I can attest she spends her days moving legislation, wrangling elected officials, that's a nice word, and trying to make Georgia a little greener and a lot better. So I have talked enough. Welcome, everyone. I want to start by asking each of you how you came to this fight and what does resisting or fighting data center expansion look like? Let's start with Angel, then go to Connie and Mary.
Thank you, Ali, and thank you everyone for being here. Buenos dias, everyone. Beautiful introductions. My name is Angel. I arrived here really from the intersection of environmental restoration and culture. We focus at Reconciliación en el Rio on specifically restoration of the Santa Cruz River and reconnecting people to those biocultural systems. And so we naturally gravitated towards the No Desert Data Center Coalition when we learned about the Project Blue Data Center, which we'll be talking about in Tucson this summer. So we have been really coming into that conversation with the perspective of water, with the perspective of ecological and cultural longevity in the Sonoran Desert, as well as, finding similar alignment in our intersections as individuals around just the futures and the jobs and the resilience that we deserve. So came to this from water, came to this from culture and people and long-term systems-based sustainability. Passing it on.
Let's go to Connie.
Thank you. It's a joy to be here. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you for putting together this incredible resource because I know that it was a tremendous undertaking, but it will be very helpful to a lot of people. I came to this work, I would say, just very personally, from getting a call from a community member who asked us to attend a town hall, and we did so. And they were asking for action afterwards. And it was a very simple request, like, how can you help us? And at that time, that was about a year ago, data centers were certainly in the conversation, and obviously we're right there and we're present. But there was nothing tangible that you could really give to the community. And they were there, they were active, they were educated, and they were ready and willing. They just needed the tools and they needed something like this, and it was not really developed. And so to go back and, like I've said, sit in my car and just feel this overwhelming rush and sense of helplessness, and to be able to sort of project like what must they be feeling as well. because this is coming, and it did come, and it has been a wave. And you can see reading all of these chats in here, it keeps coming. So that's how I've gotten here, and I have been. The steps are sometimes little, they're sometimes backwards, but um, I'm encouraged though that we are at least having the conversations, and I do think that we are making the progress to be putting the steps in place. As you guys said, scaffolding, like that's terrific. That's exactly what we need to be doing to be making the progress, putting the guardrails up and limiting what's happening right now. So thank you for doing this.
Yeah, so I entered this fight, I think, through multiple avenues. The first one was as an artist, specifically a digital artist. It was that community that was first sort of sounding the alarm on like generative AI, and the extraction of talent and creative labor to train AI. It was almost cutesy at first. I think more people were interested in turning their profile pictures into AI art, and it seemed to only really affect a very niche area of the social stratosphere. Um, but I do think, this type of disregard of collective and ecosystem thinking is really what predicates the ability of any industry to harm communities. And so that's really where my next entry point into the fight began as a person who has environmental justice at the center of my ideologies, my outlook, and my praxis. When communities began to sound the alarm on the rapid build out and the unchecked expansion of data centers and infrastructures in, Black communities, rural communities, working class communities, as well as its impact to water scarcity, energy burden, air quality, land use. I was fully activated to like begin to get into that work. And this year, I'm not gonna lie, I made my New Year's resolution to rage against data centers. So over the last 24 months, resistance to this work has really looked like shaping discourse, and protecting in communities, raising awareness and political consciousness, and cultivating intentional space for people to build self-determination and creative and collective power for how they are building forward in their communities.
Thank you so much, all of you. I want to talk now about how policy is showing up as a tangible tool for change in all of these fights that you've just raised. So let's start with Angel. The No Desert Data Center Coalition has built on rapid public mobilization opposing Project Blue in Tucson, and you all have pushed a large water users ordinance. The city and county have also pushed transparency measures to ensure that data center developers can't use NDAs. I'm curious how you all narrowed in on specific policy demands, and how do you see this fitting both into the ethos you talked about and this longer term fight?
Yeah, it is a great question. I think that policy has been kind of a really conflicting and interesting space because we're kind of in this space where we're thinking about, proactive policy, but we're also in a space of like reactive policy as well. And for us, the policy avenues became very clear just based off of the really diverse concerns of the community members, the coalition. We have coalition members that are tribal members, that are union members, that are, have families, intergenerational families, that are binational. So there's a big intersection of concern, whether that's, these technologies being used as an arm of the apparatus, the immigration incarceration apparatus, or whether it's water concerns like we were coming to the table. All of these things kind of coalesced into several different policy containers. One of the big ones that the county and the city was ready to move on was transparency. That was one of the big things that people were most frustrated by. I think a lot of organizers of all ages were grappling with this as a real conflict and a real threat to their livability, their day-to-day material well-being, their water, their air quality. So I think that was a big wake up, and the transparency was a big issue that immediately the county seemed, at least our board of supervisor county members that were, in alliance with our ethics and our goals, put forward kind of what they call sunlighting, policy. And that was great to, open up those NDAs so that we're not finding out right as these projects are trying to get rammed through. Water and energy obviously were two huge concerns as well. I personally am coming at this, a lot of our work is around reconciliation ecology, so reconnecting people to the watershed and the cultural practices and the ecological systems of place that's here in the Sonoran Desert. So water policy has become a really interesting thing that Tucson has an amazing, because of indigeneity that has, built culture in this part of the world. We have a really strong ethos around water stewardship and water conservation. But it's really interesting when you talk to, these folks from Tucson Water that are creating the policy, they're still creating policy for for users, right? Where we, as the individuals, have been invited in to help inform policy, are really looking at specificity, safeguards. How can we make sure explicitly that this river system that we're talking about is not impacted by, the energy water nexus and water use that's happening off-site? How can we explicitly name, the benefits that these groups are bringing into community, the offsets that they're bringing in, so that they're not just these vague claims of workforce development and infrastructure, right? As we've seen happening across the country, we're really trying to leverage policy as a way of naming the specifics of how we want to see this kind of regenerative future bloom. Because as they have been written in the past, it's really just been safeguard rails. Some of the things that we found, and just to touch on, just because they're mentioned in this amazing toolkit, is just the threshold, what a large water user is. Like, again, proactive versus reactive. We have one large water user that hits the 10,000 CCF a month use right now in Tucson. And that's a hospital, right? So across 4 different campuses. So when we're talking about creating policy for one user, that we don't have any of this magnitude yet, we have to start asking questions. Is like, well, do we want a policy that's saying no, or do we want a policy that's saying yes and? And I think that, like, it's not a binary. I think we can say no and yes to X, Y, and Z, such as, for example, you have listed in here, which I think is offsets, water offsets, renewable water offsets, right? And this is a huge issue for all of us Western states dealing with conversations about paper water and wet water. There's all of these water credits that we can bank, but we know you can't drink paper water. So really naming in this policy, hey, we don't want credits. We want wet water within our watershed. Here's the parameters of what we're talking about. And we want, to really shoot for aspirational policy too, not thinking about offsetting 30% like Phoenix has, but thinking about maybe 100 years in the future. Santa Fe, for example, has a 100%. You need to bring all your water if you're going to do a large hyperscale anything, right? Large development. So why don't we do that? Why don't we adopt that as a consistent across the board? Because we don't need to be having policy discussions that we're going to have to, like, undermine in 5 years when these extractive industries start hyperscaling again in the new way. We should just be setting it from our aspirations. So that's been just a little bit of a rant, but just thinking again about policy and how this water use and large water user ordinances that we've been participating in, a lot of the conversations come back and conflict come back to, these policymakers wanting to allow for policy to be enticing and inviting to development for the sake of an economic, development. And, we also have a room full of advocates that are saying we want to be able to, live here and breathe the air and drink the water in 150 years. So when we're creating policy that's only looking for projects that are going to last for 15, we're kind of, in a tough spot. So those are just some reflections and how it's been going for us. It's been a really interesting process. And I think really naming what are the benefits that we're looking for and where do we want to go has been a really important thing, because we know that these policy makers and power holders have a hard time saying no to people with more capital.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate kind of, setting out the trajectory for policymakers, right? What is the demand and what do we need to get there? And then matching that with people power to show that we're serious. Connie, I want to turn to you. And I'm dropping the questions in the chat as well, since there was a request from participants. Georgia conservation voters and others are pushing for change at the state level. What are you calling for? Walk us through that, and walk us also through how you built up to this moment of actually being able to push for state level demands.
I'll build off a little bit of what Angel was saying. I mean, and first of all, like the policymakers are short term. Like they get voted in and voted out. So like I do try and keep that in mind because because that contextualizes a lot of what it is that they're doing. And the other thing that I do try and say to a lot of the community people to which I think that they know, but that they need to hear, and the policymakers need to hear a lot of times too, is data centers don't vote, but you do. So, like, this is an underlying fundamental that we have to keep making sure that that resonates. Because again, to like underscore what Angel's saying is like these are long-term decisions that you are making with very short-term like consequences for you only. They have long-term consequences for the community and for the resources that you are sucking up with them. And so what we have been able to build up was is a little bit unique to what GCB does, and it is a cycle. We elect officials and then work with them on the legislative policy, and it only works if you actually get them elected. But at the state level, that is the hope. Right now in Georgia, it's a little bit of the wild, wild west. And we have been talking about how there are no guardrails. And if you have nothing in place, then it's a free for all and they can do whatever it is that they want to do. Um, and so it's very important to be working all of the levels within that to put those guardrails in place. I give the analogy that if you're going to go away for the weekend and you leave an open liquor cabinet with your credit cards on the table and two teenagers, you can expect your house to beat to hell when you come back. Like there's going to be nothing. And that is what happens with the data centers here. There's nothing, there's going to be nothing left at the end of the weekend if we don't take away the credit cards, lock up the liquor, and put some rules in place before we leave town. Because otherwise, they are tapping into everything. What we have built up to is saying who makes the rules here. It's exactly what Anna was saying was what is it that we want? Who makes the rules? Well, that's the Public Service Commission because they regulate utilities. So we need to start working on those elections. Where are the districts that we can be working on in terms of electeds? Who's pushing what legislation? Where do we need to be having the meetings with those legislators? And what are the most effective policies that we can be putting up for in terms of those guardrails? And I think it's also understanding your audience on both sides of the aisle and what is that universal language. And right now it's affordability and accountability. You know, people need to be able to pay their bills. They also do not like being lied to, and they don't like having the rug pulled out from under them. If they buy something, they want it to be theirs, and that means like it's their property. So if they live in a community, they want to know that there are going to be that community is going to be, those are their schools, there are going to be buses, there will be hospitals, all of those things. So they need to hold those electeds accountable. And how do they do that? We're looking for transparency. We want to know that we can have our water. We want to know that the businesses that are coming are going to be doing the same things that we're responsible for. They have to pay for their energy too. If I build a house, I got to buy I'm responsible for the wood, for all the things inside. I have to pay for that energy too. We have to know like how much water they're going to be used. And these are just like baselines. We haven't even gotten into like the real complexities. We're boiling it down to like just just the lowest common denominator in terms of you want to come to Georgia and you want to do business here. And that is sort of like the universal language. Georgians should value Georgia, and so should the businesses. And we are trying to speak something that works for everyone. This is workforce development. This is building a better Georgia. This is actually sustainability because this works very long term for all of us. And that is sort of like how we are trying to build up to good neighbors. We're not trying to take away from people. We are trying to build something that that is a long term.
Thank you so much, Connie. I also want to just pull out what you said of transparency and how much we need that, but that it's also the floor and not the ceiling. And I think that resonates with where a lot of folks are joining this conversation from, just looking at, the geographies of where people registered and legislation is getting pushed for needed transparency measures, but that can't be where it ends. So thank you. Mary, I would love to turn to you now. You bring experience both as an environmental justice organizer and former policymaker. So wondering if you can take a step back for us and try to categorize this moment of nascent policymaking around data centers. What is the conversation missing, and what do policymakers need to understand?
Yeah, this is a great question. So one of the things I really understand is that even as robust of a tool as policy has and can be for harm reduction and for shaping good governance, it does not always really include communities in the ways that it needs to, or really it places certain priorities over others with very little input from the people who actually live in our communities. So things like economic development, governmental transparency, equitable planning, land use, those things are really out of scope and the cadence of the realities of the people that are living in these communities that are impacted by these things. So when I was in elected office, I saw this all the time. It was always this claim that we were in a housing crisis, specifically, as I understood it, an affordable housing crisis. But the only policy solutions that were really being moved to address this housing crisis were to make it easier to build diverse housing types for higher income earners with the hope that eventually housing will like filter down to people who need it most right now. So the lived reality of viability really being prioritized over human needs, people needs. I mean, it's a continuous pattern that we see show up in most, if not every policy arena in different ways. What does transparency even really mean when policy decisions are made behind closed doors? They're influenced by people who donate to your election, and processed through systems that have no participatory budgeting, no community oversight, or consent mechanisms, no real shared power or accountability at the decision table. So when I was office, that was something that was often the norm. Like if it checked the economic development box, it became the priority for the body. And that was it, full stop. When we did zoning cases, for example, I never really felt like we were getting as much as we could for communities, but developers always got what they needed. They were always incentivized, oftentimes at the destruction of the history and the culture of the people in the community, that they were looking to invest in. And they were able to do so with very little pushback because people were intentionally and systemically left out of the public process. So communities did not find out what was happening until it was too late to activate themselves. And what I really learned from that experience is that there is very little community benefits from these types of profit-driven developments unless you ask and advocate and listen to community members that have not always had the space to be able to have a voice in these spaces. Data centers, add another layer and frontier to this reality that I just talked about. And they use the same imbalance, lack of government transparency, and like low community participation, as well as the legacy of environmental racism and harm to multiply what is happening here. And so the rapid expansion that we've been seeing for these data centers is simply an investment in corporate profit and solidifying the future of big tech. So really what I understand in this moment of what policy makers need to understand around data center is that there is immense opportunity to strengthen community-led governance, and policy while building something forward-thinking in the ways that policy interacts with people. So to build more comprehensive, multilateral insight into how we can include community, how we honor culture, how we act on the climate crisis, and how we do development, and what we demand of the corporations that want to build profits in our neighborhoods with our resources, and specifically the mechanisms we have to hold these corporations accountable.
Thank you so much, Mary. I'm so grateful to hear you walk us through that. And I just want to emphasize when you're talking about community-led governance, like we mean governance, we mean regulatory systems, the whole thing, not only individualized community benefit agreements that govern one particular data center development. We mean all aspects of control over our infrastructure and budget. I'm gonna ask the next round of questions to be a little bit more rapid fire, although I feel like this discussion could be 3 hours long. So Connie and Angel, let's get a little bit more into the weeds and talk about your process for pushing policy, not only what we're asking for. If each of you could give me one strategy that has either been most impactful or least successful in pushing for strong policy and regulatory change. Maybe let's start with Connie this time.
Sure. I think, and this was actually a pleasant surprise. We had a lot of engagement during session to push bills forward. Now, the bills did not pass, but these were data center bills, energy burden bills, pay their way bills that we did engage with constituents and supporters, and those were the bills that those were the action alerts that got the most traction for us throughout the year, and we were pleasantly surprised that folded into our electoral work, and we saw that those kind of results in our elections in 2025 as well. So I really feel like that was community and constituent and supporter engagement, just people being involved. If you are speaking the language and if you are putting it into like, again, understanding your audience, I think that this is like people get it. They are engaged and they know what's going on, and that is a lever that has been working for us.
Yeah, I think engagement definitely one of the just building on what you're saying, Connie, there, like we have had just I've been organizing around environmental justice and cultural justice issues in southern Arizona as long as I have been able to in my life. And I've never seen a response like I have to the data centers. And I think a lot of what has happened is people are waking up. They're aware that things are confusing or that they're being hoodwinked and that there's some nefarious deeds going on. And they're aware that like the way things are being explained to them they're paper card houses, right? They're very carefully constructed, siloed discussions and talking points. So what's been really amazing is bringing together immigration justice individuals, folks focused on, more environmental water concerns, folks focused on maybe more of just like business and jobs and union perspective, having folks come together and be able to articulate and name what it is they don't want. But what's been really powerful is learning collectively and naming what we do want, because that's the big issue with policy is that there's so much of it is a reactive, and so much of it is safeguards and rails. And they then ask the public, they say, well, what do you want? And all we know, because of what we've been informed and what we're able to participate and engage in, kind of as Mary was saying, this lack of participation, that's the problem. That's the problem, and that's where the dissonance happens. And so when we're able to get people together and say, well, that's what you didn't want, and why do you want it? And why did you not want it? But now that we understand how the Arizona Corporate Commission has like undermined our goals around public energy, now that we understand how the city's transparency policies have undermined our participation, now we can use this systems-based approach to say, what do we want? Because that is the clear metrics that we need to actually, inform this policy. We need to say more so than we don't want water to be taken out of, a negative water use. We need to say we want to see 100% water replacement. We want to see water restored into riparian areas here and here. We want to see reclaim systems supported by X amount. Now is the time for really visioning that together. And I think what's been effective is we have such a diverse group of people, but coming together around this concept of data centers and using it as a way to kind of unpack the very, very nefariously weaved systems that we have to participate at the government level. It's been a silver lining.
Thank you so much. I'm going to turn to Mary for the last question of our official panel before we get to Q&A. I'm just going to make this question very direct. How can policymakers take action to protect their constituents in this moment? And also feel free to build on what you were talking about in your previous answer too.
Yeah, I'm gonna build some things in because didn't say some things. I think there are multiple ways that people can be doing policymakers. I think one aspect of it is understanding this confusing, dense technical information about data centers and actually to be able to actually engage, regulate, and respond to it. And the second is understanding the cultural, historical, and familial connections to the communities and the land they serve. But I do think it's going to require a fundamental shift within policymakers, and that shift has to happen within the minds of policymakers. We are watching, a lot of public opposition to data centers grow, not because people are anti-technology, but because people are tired of decisions being made about their lives without them. Like, this is fully a democracy issue. It's a community versus corporation power struggle. And it's about whose voices get to shape the future of their own community. And so the truth is that the role of policy makers right now is to be community advocates, not just intermediaries, not just deal brokers, not gatekeepers, but advocates. And it's difficult for many people in this space. I know, as somebody who was in this space who called themselves an elected official, or not an advocate, not an elected official, that standing with their communities over standing between their communities and corporations is not something that a lot of people are very comfortable with in this space. Um, and so, yeah, I think the role of policymakers in this moment is breaking that cycle. They have to, bring the public back into the room in real and meaningful ways and expand public participation. So it's not just symbolic. It means, guaranteeing seats at the tables, guaranteeing timelines that allow communities to organize, guaranteeing access to information before decisions are made, while things are happening, after, before, during, and after effect at every level. And, not rejecting things that make no sense, like NDAs that high water use, energy demands, tax breaks, long-term risk. All of those things need to be in the public knowledge and in the public discourse so that they can be included and informed while all of these things are happening. So, and I think, it's different at the different levels that we are interacting with it, whether it's at local, state, or federal, but really being a community advocate because you were elected to work for the people, not for corporate interest. And yeah.
Thank you so much. I'll also invite all of you if you have any answers to the question we didn't get to in our agenda of, what are the most powerful policy demands and recommendations that can expand popular power, please feel free to drop those in the chat. In the meantime, we have been trying to consolidate some of the brilliant questions from our participants, and Ellen, I'll invite you to spotlight Kate and bring her back into the discussion. We had a number of questions about water and water use, and also questions about how do you balance recommendations in addressing the use of different resources holistically, right? Not energy on one side and water on another, but considering that sometimes energy and water use in relation to data centers, conserving one means using a little bit more of another. So I'm curious for whoever wants to answer, how do we address these holistically? And if people want to speak to more specifics with water and energy, please jump in.
I'm happy to talk on that because it's been something we've been working on a lot down here. Exactly what is being named there is what we call the energy water nexus. And for those that know the jargon and are familiar, for what it's worth, I didn't know the jargon until earlier this year. Didn't want to, but here we are. And so really understanding and making sure that this is, again, from my perspective, ecology is where culture comes from. And so looking at this from an ecological systems perspective is the best way, especially for those of us in Western states where water is a day-to-day scarcity and security concern. This is forefront of my mind. And I think a lot of people just explicitly with water, they just do not recognize where water comes from. And I think let alone like here in the Western states where a lot of our water's offset by a 250 some odd mile canal that pulls water from Colorado and brings it to Southern Arizona. A lot of people just don't even realize that that water doesn't just come from their tap. So that is a huge fundamental issue. And then when you connect that to the fact that people don't realize how much water is used to create energy, then we're dealing with a whole nother bag. So this concept of the water energy nexus is language that we really are trying to socialize and get people like familiar with, because it is a systems-based term that allows us to think about, okay, if we are going to use fossil fuels or solar or coal or nuclear, whatever mode of energy, there are other natural resources that are needed to supplement that, right? And so for us, I think it gives us space to really have what we, bioregional specific solutions. And I think down here in the Sonoran Desert in Tucson, things like solar, things like not, projects without large water, it's kind of a no-brainer, right? So I think that the more we can understand and create awareness, and that's been a big part of our kind of working groups with this large water user awareness stuff, is like, hey, can we name explicitly in this ordinance that water use and consumption shall, not should, shall address and measure offsite water use if it is being using water from our larger regional watershed, right? Because we can't talk about water offsets that are coming in from the Phoenix area to Tucson when they're using the same water that we're also dependent on, right? So it's kind of like helping separate that and understand the intersectionality of energy and water is huge and a big, big battle. I also just think that, like, for me personally, a large piece of this just comes back to place-based and biocultural education. Like, you don't know what you deserve, or if you don't know the history of the land. Like, if you don't aren't aware that there was a river running through the heart of downtown Tucson that jaguars and grizzly bears moved up and down less than 150 years ago, then why the hell are you going to care about water use? Because we need to understand where we come from to understand where we're going. So, indigenous leaders have been leading this fight globally, but especially here in southern Arizona, where the Atam and the Oeme people have been, tending the land and dealing with imperial colonialism and extractive land use for 500 years now. We really have to dive back into the context of why we're even able to live in places like swamps that have been paved over, why we're able to live in the Sonoran Desert where we get 11 inches of rain a year, right? Because then people start asking more critical questions about, like, well, maybe my same day delivery of 18 different things isn't as sustainable as I assumed, because I'm actually experiencing the impacts of this and it's changing my future from what it could be. So yeah, just really a systems approach, and really, like, it does just start with like going outside and being with community and being in these places. One of the final things I'll add is just like, when we first started the coalition, we all just kind of were a flurry of like signal threads, right? Hundreds of us across digital space. But we're in place. I might have frozen a little bit there. What I was saying was we were really digital, but then when we gathered in place, came together for the first time, we kind of this group of ragtag individuals named what we were, right? And then from there, it has been this process of coming together, connecting on the land, visiting the site that, the county's even talking about developing, so that we have a relationship and we're able to approach these conversations from the subjective context that determines the outcomes, rather than maybe the broader jargon and terminology that we see floating at the surface. Sorry, I think I cut out a little bit there, so
No,
hopefully that was.
we got most of it. We are at the hour and folks are starting to drop off, so I'm just gonna highlight a few resources that we want people to hear about, and then Mary and Connie, I'll see if you have any final words to close us out, Kate as well. There's been a lot of questions that we just couldn't get to in the chat, and I want to make sure that people know where to go for resources. So here, first of all, is the link to the guide. The QR code goes to the toolkit as well. If you have any questions about the policy recommendations, that email, datacenters@ainowinstitute.org, is where to reach Kate and me and others. If you are an organization actively fighting data centers and you are planning or moving statewide work, there is a working group for you, facilitated by a number of people who are here participating today. You can email datacenters@athenaforall.org. And I've also dropped in the chat a registration link for a December 16th call. That is a monthly call hosted by the working group and coalition for folks engaged in site fights specifically. Again, it's just for folks doing site fights right now. And that's also a great place to meet people, get resources, and get support. I've also dropped in a form for organizational endorsement of the toolkit if this is something that you feel is aligned. The more community, state, local, and national orgs and transnational orgs we can get to sign on, and community groups, the better, and the more weight it will have with policymakers. And everyone who registered today will get a recording of this, resources that answered some of the questions that we couldn't get to, a link to the microsite when it goes live in the new year, and future training information. Ellen, I'll ask you to stop sharing, and I just want to turn it back over to Mary, Connie, or Kate if you have anything else to say to close us out.
I mean, I want to say thank you for everybody who is here and in this fight. You know, and I would also say that it sounds like, I don't want to speak for Mary or Angel, but like we were all in a very similar position and are continuing to be in very similar positions. I mean, like I echo a lot of what Mary and Angel are saying, and that it takes everybody. We are constantly learning, and this is continually evolving. And so that's why these kinds of things are very, very important, because I see the Data Center Coalition also evolving too, and creating counter arguments to everything that we are doing. Whenever I go to a town hall and they are speaking the opposite, they're coming up with counter arguments every single day that are, we're going to pivot too. So I would say that this is very encouraging, though, to keep engaging on this, because it's not going away. But all of these resources are so helpful. And please reach out to us, because we are also, I'm certainly not an expert, but learning, and I'll do whatever I can to help you.
Yeah, and the only thing I want to say, I'll keep it short. Thank you for this toolkit. I think it's going to be really indicative and relevant to the moment we are in. And lastly, power to the people, power to the peaceful, and power to the people who are willing to fight to make peace. That's all.
Let's end on that note. Thank you so much, everyone. We'll see you in the fight.